All right. So, as you can see, today I will be talking about consent violation and deprivation. It's something that came about after thinking a little bit about veganism and then reading about philosophy of death a little bit, more specifically position of David Benatar. And and I always had this, these two different arguments for antinatalism, the consent argument and the asymmetry argument. And I always thought of them of two different arguments for the same position. But today I will look into exactly what kind of difference exists between them. And I believe that there is a very important fundamental distinction between these two arguments and the way that we can use them and the consequences that will follow from that distinction that we will make. So it will be a little bit theoretical, but in the end, it will be some interesting conclusions that we can make through this. So let me just give an overview of these two arguments. So the point is not really the argument themselves, but what lies behind them. And I believe that when we really understand these two arguments, it can show us that there is a kind of ontological distinction between what the asymmetry argument is working with and what the consent argument is working with, and what follows from it. All right, so I will try to formulate them in the way that I understand them. Of course, this doesn't have to be exact rendition of what, for instance, Benatar would say, but this is the way that I understand the argument, and I would defend it. So for the asymmetry argument, I move like this. First, I say that moving a deprived being, I will go through it, premises one by one, and then I will explain them. So premise one is moving a deprived being out of existence removes actual deprivation. Premise two, moving a satisfied being out of existence does not create actual deprivation. From 1 and 2, it follows that creation of a being always creates actual deprivation and never removes it. 4, it's always better to remove actual deprivation than to create it. And 5, from 3 and 4, follows that we should never create a being. So let's go through each premise one by one. So the first premise says that moving a deprived person, not a person, but moving a deprived being in general out of existence removes actual deprivation. So this basically means that if you think about someone in deprivation, someone who's deprived of something, of their health, of their money, of their time or whatever. If you imagine them just not existing, not by moving out doesn't mean killing them. It means just imagine that they don't exist. They never came to existence. Going back in time, remove them out of existence. Now that's good. Like, for example, we have a hospital here close to my home. It's for children with cancer. And there are little children, so many of them, and all suffering. Just imagine that building, right? Now imagine that I tell you that building doesn't exist. I just made it up. I believe you would say, okay, that was good. That's good. That's good that there isn't such a hospital there with all the children suffering. There exist such hospitals, but not here. And it's good that there is no such hospital here, that I made it up. So in that sense, that's the moving out of existence, the way that I'm talking about. That there is a deprivation, but then you say, okay, what if there wasn't any deprivation there? So that's the moving out of existence. And I believe we can defend this, that when you see someone in deprivation and then you just imagine them just not existing, the deprivation would also go out of existence. You see someone suffering, and you're like, if they never came into existence, that scene, that deprivation at that point in space and time would not exist. So moving a deprived being out of existence removes actual deprivation. But moving a satisfied being, and by satisfied I mean someone who's not deprived of anything, moving a satisfied being out of existence does not create an actual deprivation, because there wouldn't be anyone to be deprived of. So in the same format, imagine like a park close to our home. Again, people are children, they're playing there. They're happy, it's fine, they're having fun. But now imagine that actually I made it up, it doesn't exist. Did it create any actual deprivation? No. if you think that it does, it's because you're thinking of existing beings. So you might be thinking about those same children existing, sitting in their home, and they're like, oh my God, there's nowhere to go to play. You're thinking about their deprivation. Or you might be thinking about people who will look at those children and they will like, oh, it's so nice that the children are playing there, but they're not seeing that anymore. So you're thinking of them being deprived of seeing that, scene of children playing. But there is no actual deprivation for those children, it is in a sense that they're deprived of playing those games if they just never came into existence, because who is deprived? No one exists to be deprived, to be actually deprived. So that's the asymmetry that we see between 1 and 2. In 1, there's an actual deprivation that when we remove that person, that being out of existence, an actual deprivation is removed. But when you remove a satisfied being out of existence, no actual deprivation is created because no one is there to be deprived. And from 1 and 2, it follows that creation of a being always creates actual deprivation and never removes it, right? So if moving out can only remove deprivation and can never create deprivation, the other direction, coming into existence, can only create deprivation and never removes it, right? It follows from 1 and 2. And 4, everyone would agree that it's always better to remove actual deprivation than to create it, right? Removing actual deprivation is always better than creating it. And from 3 and 4, it follows, since creating a being always creates deprivation, actual deprivation, and never removes it, and it's always better to remove actual deprivation than to create it, it follows that we should never create a being. So that's the gist of the asymmetry argument. Well, not the gist of it, I gave the whole details, but anyway. Which works based on an asymmetry between, deprivation, the actual deprivation that exists, but the deprivation that wouldn't be created when you remove a person out of existence. So that's one argument. And if you notice, I used a deprived being because it can be generalized to any being. It doesn't have to be like a person. It just can be any sentient being. And what is the consent argument? The consent argument is like this. Again, going through the premises. Premise 1, we should not impose a judgment on a rational being. Creating a rational being always judges her existence to be better than non-existence. Premise 3, a non-existent being cannot judge her existence to be better than a non-existence. 4, which follows from 2 and 3, creating a rational being always imposes a judgment on her. And 5, from 1 and 4, it follows that we should never create a rational being. So premise 1 says that we should not impose a judgment on a rational being. So that's the assumption here that we have on consent. In a sense that, now what I mean by rational being, if you watch my videos on metaphysics, in the lecture on person, I define a person, a rational being, as an entity who's the subject of his experience, who is the agent of his actions, but more importantly, he is the asker of the normative question. In the sense that we're not only doing things, but we ask what's better to do? What's the best thing to do here? Should I do A or should I do B? Is A good for me or B good for me? We judge these situations. So we ask this kind of normative question, which one is better? What should I do? Should I do this or should I do that? So that's what I mean by a rational being. I mean a person. And the idea is that we should not impose a judgment on rational being. And this comes from the assumption of rational autonomy, the autonomy of rational beings. Now, I don't want to defend this position. It's not completely unrelated to the categorical imperative of Kant, but I don't want to get into those details as well. I guess everyone can agree with this. It's something that we should respect, in a sense that since we are rational beings and we don't want that to happen to us, we want to be able to make judgments for ourselves, to be able to say what's good for me. In the same sense, we should respect it for other rational beings as well. So we should not impose a judgment. We should not tell someone else what's good for them. We should not impose something on them and say, this is good for you. No, they have to decide what's good for them. So that's premise 1. The premise 2 is creating a rational being always judges her existence to be better than non-existence. And this is because those who create a rational being are rational themselves. So our parents are also rational entities. They're also persons. So when someone decides to create a person, what they're actually doing is that they're judging through their own rationality that it's better for that child to exist than not to exist. So they're making a judgment that her existence, by her I mean the rational being, is better than non-existence, is something that should be done. So they're making a judgment on this normative question. And premise 3 says that a non-existent being cannot judge her existence to be better than non-existent because they don't exist. Something that doesn't exist cannot judge her existence to be better than non-existence. So it follows from 2 and 3 that if we create a rational being, it always imposes a judgment on her. Because she cannot make a judgment, you make the judgment. So it's your call. It's always imposing a judgment. And since we should not impose a judgment, it follows that we should never create a rational being. So you can see that in this argument, on the consent argument, the focus is on rational being. On the asymmetry part, which is based on the deprivation, is just on the sentient. Now I believe that this there's a distinction between these two arguments because there's an ontological distinction between a violation of consent and a deprivation, in the sense that they are two different sorts of things. So why is that? I mean, we can compare these two together. Violation of consent and deprivation. I believe they're different things. I wouldn't go into all the details, all the ontological details of it, but just a couple of points to make that distinction. I believe violation of consent is something that it has a point in time. It happens at a point in time, while deprivation, it has a time duration. Consent can be violated in an instance, in other words. But deprivation, you cannot be deprived for an instance. You see, an instance, it doesn't have a duration. It just says at that moment. But you cannot be deprived at that moment. You can only be deprived for a period of time. A violation of consent is a crossing of a line or threshold. Deprivation is more like remaining over or under a threshold. For example, you might say that you forced this party on me. You forced me to be in this party. That's a crossing of a line. Or you might say that you gave me coffee while I'll ask for tea. That's a violation. That's you making a judgment on my behalf. And you put sugar in it while I was looking away. You didn't ask for it. I was looking away. You put sugar in it. That's violation of consent. And you can see that they're happening. There are decisions that you made, and there are things that happen at a point in time. While on the account of deprivation, it would be to say you wasted my time in this party. You see, that's a period. You made me anxious by giving me coffee. That's a period that you were anxious because of that caffeine in the coffee. And you made me sick by putting sugar in it. I felt bad for eating that sugar. So you can always sense this kind of difference between a violation of consent and deprivation, that a violation of consent is something that is like crossing a line. It happens at a point in time. But the deprivation, it's something that has a duration. You have to endure that deprivation. And it also happens in the way that we count them. Like a violation of consent, because it's like a crossing of a line, you can count it. You can say, okay, you forced me to this party, I asked for coffee, you gave me tea, and I was looking away, you put sugar in it. 3 times you violate my consent. But the deprivation is like more like measuring, how many hours did you waste my time? How anxious did you make me? For how long? Or how long was I sick because of eating that sugar? And more importantly, the violation of consent part, rationality is necessary for it. Because as we said, the first premise is that the rational being, we should not impose a judgment on rational being. Because consent is something that you need that kind of normative behavior in that agent to ask what's better for me. And a violation would be to impose a decision, a judgment. But for deprivation, sentient is enough. So we can see that these two arguments basically they are tackling different aspects of us. They both work for us because we do have a rational aspect and we do also have a sentient aspect. Now for me, it's not necessary, but for me, because I'm a substance dualist, they're very clean and neat because I have this kind of person, substance, that's the rationality side. They'll also have this kind of animal side, the body, that's the sentient part, and you can have these two not completely separated, but at least you can have a nice parallel between them. But the point is that these two arguments apply to us because we have that rationality side, and we can also talk about the deprivation. So we're not only, by coming into existence, not only our consent has been violated, but we're also being deprived of basically anything that we're deprived of during life. There are actual deprivation by coming into existence. Now, why is this important? Why is this distinction between consent and deprivation important? Because I believe that it will have some practical applications. For instance, on death, Benatar's view on death is that death is bad because it's based on the deprivation account. So Benatar basically says that he's talking about death of Beth, and he says that these are the propositions that we can say about her death. He talks about this in the book Human Predicament. He says that Beth is the person for whom death is bad. The period during which Beth is dead is a period during which her death is bad for her. You see, so he has a deprivation account, so he talks about a period. That period begins with the moment of Beth's death. This is an important point, because you might think that, hey, like, sometimes I talk about deprivation as a point in time. But if you think about it, it's not a point in time. It's the starting point of that period. So sometimes that starting point is important, so it stays in our mind, but it's not about that point specifically, it's about a period and the starting point of that period. So that period begins with the moment of Beth's death, and thus that is the time when the bad first befalls her, even though the badness of death is clearly not restricted to that instant, and will not be felt as death terminates consciousness. And D, according to at least some views, it's always true, both while Beth is alive and after she's dead, that her death is bad for her during the period when she's dead. He also talks about this kind of eternal badness. But the point is that he says that my view says that the bad of death befalls someone when it first occurs, and it continues to be bad for as long as it lasts. So that's the view that Benatar has. And to me, it's a kind of strange position to have, and I will get back to this. I also explained it in the short video that I put up, the kind of strange conclusion that it would have, but I will come back to it. Now on the other side of this kind of viewpoint, so Benatar is basically answering another position, and that's the Epicurean position. The Epicurean position says that death cannot be a deprivation. And what's the argument for it? The argument is like this. One, a deprivation requires a period of time. Epicurus talks about the fact that you need to feel that, you need to experience that deprivation. So you need to exist for that period. You need to endure through that deprivation. So deprivation requires a period of time. Premise 2, before death of A, and A is that person or Beth, before death of A, no deprivation due to death exists. Note that we are just talking about the deprivation of death itself. Of course, there are some effects, because you might be afraid of death, you might get anxious, you might be sick before actually dying. That's a different issue. We're just talking about the death itself, just the annihilation of your existence. So before death of A, no deprivation exists, right? Because you haven't died yet. Now, after death of A does not exist to be deprived. Premise 4, it follows from 2 and 3 that before or after death of A is not deprived. Now, premise 5, any period of time is either before death or after death of A, right? But then it follows from 1, 4, and 5 that A's death cannot be a deprivation, because deprivation requires a period of time. Any period of time will either be before the death of A or after death of A. But in premise 4, it says that before or after A is not deprived, so A's death cannot be a deprivation. So Benatar's basically the position that he provides is a kind of anti-Epicurean position as a response, as an alternative to this. But why is it that Benatar thinks that he should provide an alternative to this position? Because he doesn't really defend the position that he has. So if you read the section on death, he basically proposes this alternative, and he says that even though all the other bads that we talk about does not follow the same pattern, I mean, it follows all of them, but there's one most important element, is that for all the other bads that we talk about, that person has to exist to endure through that period of deprivation, but death is a special case. Now, that sounds like question begging. I mean, not question begging, but at least you have to explain why death is such a special case. And he doesn't do that. And I guess the only argument that he has, like if you read through it, the only strong point that Benatar tries to make is that this Epicurean position leads to absurd results. He talks about many different forms of the Epicurean argument, tries to argue against it. But from what I understood, it's the main thing that really bothers Benatar is the absurd conclusions that follows from Epicurean position. So he has a kind of like, reductio ad absurdum argument against Epicurean. But the point is that if we make that distinction between violation of consent and deprivation account in an ontological sense, then we can see that death can be bad without being a deprivation. So Benatar's refutation of this position is that, one, we would have to revise our views about how bad painless murder is. So that's the problem that Benatar has, that if we accept the Epicurean position that death is never a deprivation for the person who dies, then if you painlessly kill someone, then nothing bad has happened. And two, he also tries to undermine the position that Epicurean has, that you have to endure that experience of deprivation for it to be bad. So he gives this example that suppose that your spouse is unfaithful to you by having sex with someone else, and this is done without your ever learning of that infidelity. And if Epicurean position is correct, then you're not deprived of anything, but we still feel like something bad has happened. So he says, okay, see, this doesn't make sense. So it seems that Epicurean cannot be true. But the point is that these two examples, I believe, badness of both of these cases seems to come from the consent violation and not deprivation. See, now that we made that distinction between consent and deprivation as two different ontological kinds, we can actually go to the consent. We can say, okay, it's not a deprivation, none of these two cases, but it's still bad because it's a consent violation. And we can see that because one, about death, as we said, is a crossing of threshold, and it's bad because you're imposing the decision on me. You see, life and death is a judgment that I can make. I can decide whether I want to live or die. When you kill me, you make that decision for me. You make that judgment for me. It's better that you die. So that's a violation of consent. You're crossing something, and it doesn't need any period. So the moment that you kill me, you wrong me. So that's for one. Two is a little bit more complicated. So imagine that your spouse is unfaithful to you by having sex with someone else, and you don't know about this. And Benatar claims that this is a deprivation, even though you don't know it. Now, whether this is deprivation or not, that's a different issue. But I guess we can still claim that's not a deprivation if it doesn't impact you at all. I mean, it might be a deprivation in the same sense that when you put sugar in my coffee, it's a violation of my consent, but it has some kind of effects in sense of deprivation. So if your spouse is unfaithful to you, then it might impact your relationship with her. So there might be some deprivation, but the actual act of that sexual act, I don't think is a deprivation. Rather, it's a violation of consent. And I believe the way that we can actually distinguish between these two is to look back again at the properties of these two different kinds of things. One of them was a crossing of a line, the other one was enduring something. Now suppose that it's not about sex, unfaithful. Let's suppose, just to make the problem simpler, let's suppose that it's about kissing someone. And also let's suppose that the moment that your spouse kisses someone else, that person dies. Not as a consequence of the kissing, in a sense that you cause that person to die, because someone might claim, okay, there's a duration of time from this cause and effect. Let's just suppose that it's just accidentally the moment that you kiss her or kiss them, they die right at that moment. It just happens at the same time. And there's no duration during which, there's no period during which that you have been kissing someone, It's just one moment you kissed and they die. So there is no period of time during which you are deprived of anything, if you are ever deprived of anything. But we still feel like something bad has happened. Even though she kissed at one moment, she's still unfaithful. And I guess this hints that it's not about deprivation account, it's about the fact that she crossed a line. She violated something about our rational judgment. So again, this I believe it shows that the badness that we feel is not from the sort of deprivation that we feel, even though it might be there something related to it. But even if we clean out all the deprivation, we still feel the badness because of the consent violation part. So we can still be on the side of Epicurean arguments to say that death is not a deprivation, and yet don't get to these absurd positions. Now, this has three interesting consequences, what I've been saying up to now. Now, two of them are very controversial, but one of them is not. So the first conclusion that I would make from this kind of ontological distinction between consent violation and deprivation is that it's not wrong, at least based on these two issues of consent or deprivation. It's not wrong to painlessly kill a sentient being that does not constitute a person. Because if there is no person, there is no violation of consent. And if you painlessly kill a sentient being, there is no deprivation. So no deprivation, no violation of consent, at least regarding these two issues. I mean, there might be some other accounts of why this might be bad, like in terms of social effects or anything. But just in terms of these two, it's not wrong to do so. Now, this is controversial, right? Because I'm basically saying that it's possible, at least theoretically, to kill animals that are not persons, that are not rational beings like us. Now, I have to modify this in a couple of ways. One is that I'm not saying that in practice this is possible, because in practice we can never painlessly kill. Animals become aware, they know they're going to die, they become anxious. They are social animals, so there's a community. We will impose deprivation on other animals. So the distance between theory and practice is large. That's one point. The other one is that someone might accuse me of being of speciesism, right? But the point is that I'm not talking about human beings versus other animals. I'm talking about persons versus other animals. So for me, so just to show that I'm not a speciesist, for me it's metaphysically possible to have a human being that doesn't constitute a person. Now, if we do have that, then I believe that it's not wrong to painlessly kill that animal, that animal of the species Homo sapien, because it doesn't constitute a person. So I don't make any difference between this type of animal or that species of animal. I make a difference between a person and other sentient beings that do not constitute a person. So that's one controversial claim, which I believe follows from this distinction. The other one that's not controversial is actually something that I believe we should hold. It's the opposite of the controversial claim that Benatar makes, that death is bad, that it starts from the moment of death, the badness, and it lasts as long as the death lasts. And the problem is that if intermittent non-existence, so this is the position that I believe would follow, that if intermittent non-existence is metaphysically possible, in the sense that when we die, it's possible for us to come back, I believe that coming back to existence is still a bad thing. But based on Benatar's position, since it's a bad thing, since it's a deprivation, we should stop it as soon as possible. At least it's a good thing to do it. You will remove a deprivation. But then you face a challenge here, because if Benatar is an antinatalist and he wants to argue for extinction of human beings, now suppose that this is metaphysically possible to bring people back to life, then that means that the moment that science device becomes available, then Benatar should also start advocating for bringing people back from dead. But there seems to be a tension, because on the one hand, he's trying to reduce the population, but on the other hand, he's also advocating for increasing the population by bringing people back from dead. So he is kind of undoing his own position. I don't think that makes sense. I believe that the consent part says that the first time that you brought me into existence, you violated my consent. That was my decision. When you killed me, you violated my consent. When you brought me back to existence, you again violated my consent. That's 3 violation. And 2 wrongs here don't make it right. So if you violated to bring me back to existence, that doesn't make it right. So even if you kill me and you have the option to bring me back, you shouldn't. Because again, you're making a judgment on my behalf, then that's something that I should do, not you. So, and the third consequence is what I said earlier, that in the argument for consent, and one of the reasons that people don't look good. I mean, they don't think that the consent argument is a good argument. Is that I said if a rational being cannot make a judgment, so that's the consequence, that we cannot impose a judgment on a rational being even if they cannot make such a judgment. So that was applied when we bring someone into existence. They don't exist, so they cannot make a rational judgment. But when we bring them into existence, we make that judgment on their behalf. People will say, okay, but when people are born, they cannot make any judgment. Like a newborn baby, what kind of judgment can they make? Even if you claim that they're rational entities, they cannot make any judgment. So they think, it doesn't make any sense. We cannot really ask for consent. But that's like saying that, the fact that we cannot, the fact that the consent of the baby will always be violated does not reduce the gravity of the situation. It adds to it. That's like saying that if you're living in a society where people are born into slavery, then it really doesn't make sense to criticize slavery. Because you're like, what are you saying? Like, okay, if people are born into slavery, that's what they do the moment they're born. There's nothing else. It's of natural necessity that they're born slaves. So it doesn't really make sense to criticize it. But that doesn't make sense. That just means that our situation in the society is so messed up that people are born into slavery of natural necessity. So in the same sense, if you say that we are born and we cannot make judgments, that just adds to the gravity of the situation, because it just means that our situation in existence is so messed up that it is of natural necessity that when we are born into a situation in which our judgment and our consent will be violated constantly for years. That just makes things worse. And I see this as a kind of counterpart to the deprivation account that Benatar gives. So Benatar first talks about the asymmetry, and from there he concludes that coming into existence is a harm. But then he continues by talking about how bad our lives are, and how bad we judge our life. I mean, we think it's much better than it actually is. And so in the end, he concludes that it's actually not just a harm, it's actually great harm to come into existence. So the counterpart of that for the consent argument is that it not only just violates your consent, it's greatly violates you, because it puts you in a position that you will just, of natural necessity, you will be violated for years to come, until you really become aware of what's going on and you basically take control of your life. And this is not just a theoretical thing. I mean, we do feel violated if you just look back through your life. Don't you really feel violated for the country you were born into, for the family you were born into, the culture, the food, the movies you watched, the school you went to, the things you talked about, the things they taught you, the things that they told you it's good, the things that they told you is bad. You know, everything, the clothes that you wear, the people you talked to, you know, places you visited, all these things, they shaped who you are. And when you look back, you feel like, you know, I was the same person who was back then, the same rational being, but I just couldn't make a decision for myself, and these people just kept making it for me. You couldn't do anything about it. No one can do anything about it, but that doesn't mean that then everything's fine. That just means how a serious harm it is to bring someone into existence. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I was trying to keep it short. I don't know how long it is, but yeah, I believe if we can make this kind of distinction between the ontology of consent violation and deprivation, we can actually make sense much more of these two arguments that we have and how it relates to death, and also it might have these kind of interesting consequences for vegetarian and being vegan. Thank you.